Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this presentation. Long-awaited presentation, I should say. We were first hoping to have Susan come and present to us in 2020. That didn't happen, but we are very excited that she's able to join us this evening to share about her book, The Crusade for Forgotten Souls. So I will go ahead and turn it right over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we had 2 cancellations during the course of the pandemic. I was scheduled twice and had to cancel, so it's really a pleasure to be here on a third try. But in some ways, this story, this Crusade for Forgotten Souls, has gained more relevance, despite the fact it took place in the 1940s and 50s, because in this time period, awareness of mental health issues was made worse by the pandemic. And now issues of gun violence and the mental health of shooters is very much with us today. But this story is the story of how Minnesota became the nationwide leader in mental health reform and a model for all states to follow. Now, it did fall back over time, so it's no longer the case. But it's a real Minnesota story of real Minnesotans who made a difference. I'm not going to tell the whole story tonight, but I just want to give you some sense of how I found various aspects of the story and the search for what had actually happened and who was really responsible for the reform. I didn't look for this story. It found me, literally, in 2013 when I was cleaning out my son Ben's closet and a bag of papers fell on my head. And in it, this is really true, in it was a scrapbook of clippings from the 1940s and speeches typed on an old manual typewriter. Some of you remember, onion skin and all that. Old photos and reports about mental health reform in the 1940s in Minnesota. Why did he have them? They were papers from his grandfather, who was my father-in-law, Arthur Foote, who was the minister of Unity Church in St. Paul from 1945 to 1970, and who passed away in 1999. He had played a major role in the reform, and these are papers he had saved. You know how you put stuff, you save it? And then he died, and his daughter was sort of parceling out stuff, and my son lived in Minnesota, and so he got these papers. He didn't know what to do with them. Top of the closet, right? 10 years later, they fell into my lap. I started going through them, and I felt in my bones there was a story. And at first blush, to the extent that anyone remembers the story, which is now, 70, 80 years ago, the governor, Luther Youngdahl, is given all the credit. Luther Youngdahl was a Swedish Republican Lutheran. I gave a talk in California and I said that, blank faces. In Minnesota, people know Swedish Republican Lutheran, they get an idea of what he was like. He had a big heart, and he gets the credit. And he's the one who's responsible for this name, the Crusade for Forgotten Souls. 4 years of research and writing later, which was really an odyssey of discovery that was quite an amazing experience for me. The story of the ordinary people who persuaded Youngdahl to take up the cause and were his strongest allies and trusted advisors, who built a statewide advocacy movement, which was really remarkable in that time, of citizens that broke through the stigma of shame and passed groundbreaking legislation in 1949 and 1951. Well, really, in much of history, the contributions of ordinary people are often lost and are especially challenging to unearth 70 years later after the fact. So tonight, I wanted to introduce you to 3 of these ordinary citizens' heroes, and they happen to be 3 women who were not public figures, were not in the limelight, but who, despite the constricted role of women at the time, made contributions that were overlooked until I found them. So, part of what I also wanted to explain in relationship to some of these people is I didn't start out to write a book. I started out to find out how it happened. But having been a history major long ago, I'm not interested in dry history. I always felt that history is made by people, ordinary people who have motivations and drives and capacities and limitations. And so as the idea of the book took shape, once I began writing, I used what I learned, English majors might know, the way it's written is what's called creative nonfiction, which means that everything in it is true. It all actually happened, and it's accurate as to all of those details. The creative part is contrasted with other nonfiction like academic or technical writing. It's written to bring the reader in as if they are there, as if these are real people, not on this date this happened, that happened, and that happened. So it's rooted in accurate fact, but it's readable. And that was really important to me. So tonight I'll read a couple of passages from the text to illustrate sort of what I found in sort of documents and how the story was brought to life, what motivates people, why do they do what they do, where are they when these things are happening. So I went on this, what I call an odyssey. I was on the hunt. Haunted the Minnesota Historical Society, county historical societies where some of these hospitals existed, went to towns all over the state, and, found a few folks who were still alive who had memories and looked for descendants of those who were no longer living. So first, a bit of context of what the problem was. And we're pretty close to St. Peter. Some of you might have had experiences there. But Minnesota had 7 mental hospitals, which at the time were called insane asylums, and 1 large state institution for what they called feeble-minded and imbeciles. The first one was built in St. Peter in the late 19th century when there were waves of optimism for cures, and a thought that if you built a place outside of where these bad social influences were, you could create a healthier society for people to be in. There was a huge building boom. This was happening all over the country. There were some huge institutions like Fergus Falls, which is still standing but no longer an institution, a very, very almost alarming place. It's so big and so institutional. Anoka, Wilmer, Hastings, Cambridge State Hospital. And at the time, conditions in the hospital were terrible. In the 1930s, Great Depression and wartime, cuts in the meager budgets. There was some data from the United States Public Health Service. Minnesota was among the worst in the nation in terms of per capita spending, which was pennies a day, staffing ratios, and excessive use of restraints. So many people tied to beds or tied to chairs. And those 2 ladies, that's from Rochester, they're in straitjackets tied to the benches. The buildings were in disrepair, unpalatable food, overcrowded, just working conditions terrible. And at the time of our story, there were 15,000 Minnesotans in these institutions, 80% of them involuntary, committed and adjudicated insane. About 35% of them were senile elderly. This was our long-term care. This is where people were sent. Many were misfits or people family wanted out of the way, people with transient problems, grieving widows, people with syphilis, and a whole range of disorders that we would now identify as mental illness, from mild or temporary to severe. The hospitals were run by the state in a state bureaucracy which was cynical and secretive, and the governor and the state bureaucracy set the budgets, and the culture was set by the superintendents, mostly custodial. What's very interesting as I've talked about this, how many people have memories back, grandmothers or relatives, people in the town that kind of disappeared because the shame was so high. The shame was incredible. People didn't want to talk about it. Even some of the employees were ashamed that where they worked. One quote I found, that it's better to work in a house of ill repute than in a mental hospital. So then at the time of the story, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to let you know, there was a beginning of some expose of what was going on in various parts of the country. And there was a big controversial expose in Life magazine. Anyone remember Life magazine? In the old days, that was where you got pictures before television and, of events. And Life magazine had a big expose that was done mostly by conscientious objectors who were assigned to work in the institutions. It's kind of a really interesting history. They were horrified. But in Minnesota, Pioneer Press had a story, "No snake pits in Minnesota. All is well here." The paper was repeating the party line that people in the institutions were well cared for and that negative stories were bad because they upset families unnecessarily. And of course, we need more money, but trust us to spend it. So that's the historical context of this effort. And here was the puzzle. I read these clippings and I wondered, how did it get started in Minnesota? So the first thing I looked at was a biography of Luther Youngdahl. There was only one, written in the 1950s. He gets the credit for the reform. But in the few pages in his biography dedicated to this topic, there was this line: "It all started with Engla Shea, an attendant in mental hospitals." Who the hell is that? I read all the newspaper articles. I began to do research. I asked myself, who is this Engla? And I learned her name meant angel in Norwegian. She's not mentioned anywhere in the newspaper articles. So I started digging through census records, and I got some Norwegian friends to help me. Land records, town newspapers, not much of a paper trail, but a few things. She'd been in the Salvation Army. She grew up in New Folden, way up in Marshall County, and she'd worked in Anoka State Hospital, where in the census it said inmates and hired. So that's how the people were described in the hospitals. Enough to intrigue, but who was she, really? How did she get to be the one who started it all? So this is the part that is really fun. So how do you find somebody? Engla Shea, born in 1895 with a handwritten birth certificate in Warren, Minnesota. She never married. That's helpful because her name never changed. She had no children. She had 2 sisters and a brother. This is all census data. So using old newspapers, obituaries, Facebook, I kind of tracked her sister down a few generations, and I wrote to these relatives in Wisconsin that I could locate and ask, are you relatives? A few months later, Engla's great-great-niece, descendant of Engla's sister, emailed that she had her papers and her diaries, and I could come look at them. Road trip. Wyowega, Wisconsin. I went with a friend. We put our printers in the back of the car so we could make copies. it was unbelievable. This great-great-niece had found the papers when her grandmother had been put in a nursing home, and they're incredible. And so when you read the book, it's incredible the kind of information you could never get. It's not in a history book. Autobiographical stories and photos and diaries while she worked at Anoka and when she worked at Rochester State Hospitals. I spent days reading and transcribing the journals, which painted a picture, a real picture of what it was like for people, human beings, in these hospitals. And Engla, who wanted to be a writer, and here she is, wrote patient stories, which comprises the first chapter of the book. Vignettes of patients. She didn't give their names, not because she didn't think they were important, but because if anybody in the institution, the power structure, found it, they would identify it. So she gave them initials very often, or only first names. So for Engla, these patients, and this is her in her little immigrant family home. That's her family, and she's standing behind her father. And there she is in Minneapolis about the time she was working at Anoka. So for Engla, the patients were not forgotten souls. But what was her motivation to do this? The stories and the diaries tell us her motivation. So it's a remarkable one. Her father, Anders, in 1928, who she adored, checked himself into Fergus Falls in a deep depression, Fergus Falls State Hospital. It was a powerful motive for her because she adored her father. So here's just a little excerpt so you can get a feel for this. She wrote, and this was a story, so it was dad and daughter, but it was clearly autobiographical. She wrote, "The years can't change things between us, Dad. We still understand each other," wept the daughter. "Dad, don't you remember?" pleaded the daughter. "Daddy's girl," you used to say. "Do you mean to say all that has changed?" she said, wiping the tears from her eyes. "I don't want to remember it. I want to forget the past," he sighed. "All my life I had been so alone." That night, she tried to piece together her father's tragic life and cursed fate that it should have dealt thus with such a wonderful man. Her mind went back again to the quotation she used to answer the roll call with in grammar school. "Do something worth living for. Do something worth dying for. Do something to show there's a mind, heart, and soul within you." Almost accidentally, she had stumbled upon a cause that was bigger than herself, her father, and her entire family, and it made her happy. That was Engla's soul, which she brought out. So driven by the love of her father, who was in Fergus Falls for the rest of his life for about 30 years, which was not uncommon. Once you were in, you rarely got out. As she wrote, she crashed the gates and was hired at Anoka State Hospital as a low-level attendant in a custodial job in 1939. So then the question is, okay, this is a story, this is a person. How do you put the reader in this context? And that's what I really worked on doing, so that the facts are true, but how do you make it work for a reader to really feel it? And so I want to just read you. We know she went to Anoka. She must have had a first day. Here's the story. Keys jangling, the nurse in a starched white uniform marched up the stone steps and unlocked the door to Cottage 3, one of 10 imposing brick and stone buildings on the Anoka campus. And here it is. It's still standing. Engla followed, carrying all her worldly belongings in 2 suitcases. She stepped into the building where she would live and work. It was a dark, depressing gray, no color anywhere. The first floor was designed to include reception and recreation rooms, but due to overcrowding, now housed a doctor's quarters and space for staff. She trudged up the open stairway to the second floor, the stale air tinged with odors of urine and disinfectant. She saw women in camisoles, which is a euphemism for straitjackets. She saw women in camisoles strapped to wooden benches, their hair shaved off, wearing similar baggy denim dresses. They drooled and ranted and raged. There were feces on the floor. Metal beds were lined up, nearly touching each other. The nurse led the way up a narrower staircase to Engla's third floor quarters, one cramped room with a slanted ceiling, a bed, desk, and dresser. She would share the small bathroom at the end of the hall with all the other attendants. "This is it," said the nurse curtly, and disappeared down the stairs. Engla stood at the dormered window, which was too small to allow much light or to catch the breezes that blew off the Rum River in the distance. She could hear the cries and moans of the patients below, a sound that would hum in her ears all day and haunt her dreams at night. She put down her suitcases, sat on the metal bed, and swept her graying hair out of her eyes. She was 43 years old. This dingy attic room was now home. The goal is to really take us, the readers, into the world that she was in. And to the extent that I'm able to do that in the writing, it makes history come alive. The creative, now I've got all my papers. Okay. So through both the material that was available in the historical societies and the Engla's own writings, I was able to track how she became starting it all. So she worked in these institutions. She was just engaged with the patients, wanted to help them. You'll see that in the patient description. She tried to change things from within, but she met with resistance. She was denied opportunities for greater responsibility and training and promotion. She was ridiculed by the nurses, rebuffed by the doctors as a troublemaker. The working conditions were 48-hour work weeks, split shifts, and whatever, difficulty. But she wanted to know more, so she actually took courses at the university. Took the bus down from Anoka to learn more. And that was the same time she discovered sort of the humanist religion that was sort of popular at the time in this First Unitarian Church. She was taken with the notion that their goal was to make the world a better place. She battled the system. She tried to get a transfer to Rochester State Hospital. She got there. It seemed initially better, but the culture wasn't really that different. She got wind of these conscientious objectors. She wrote to them. And this is somebody who didn't always have a pen, often only a pencil, and save up money for 2 cents or whatever for a stamp. I mean, this is not something you would, our modern time of communication. It was work, given her her situation. So she made friends. She contacted these conscientious objectors and got some of their materials that we're talking about, how conditions should change. And she jumped on the bandwagon and began what she called spreading the gospel of mental health reform, a frenetic one-person crusade. She got a poor reception from the higher-ups at Rochester. She even went, and it's in her diary, she even went to the State Department of Public Institutions and talked to one of the leaders there. This is a woman with limited education, no money, no status, no husband, a limp from polio when she was a kid. She had no status, and she fought. And when I talked to the nursing students at St. Olaf and at the U, I said, yes, see something wrong and speak up. Think of how hard it was for Angela. This should be an inspiration to you. She was unintimidated, and she fought for what she believed was right. Then there was a turning point. In October of 1946, her minister, which was this Unitarian church in Minneapolis, invited her to this conference of Unitarians, which was a tiny little sect in Minnesota, 2,000 in the whole state. And the planners had selected mental health as a topic that maybe they should work on, having read what was happening elsewhere, and because it was post-war and they wanted to do something good for society, after the Second World War in the 40s, there'd been so much suffering, and it was like, let's do something good. And that's where the materials began to cross, because I had all these Arthur Foote materials that fell on my head, and Angla's diary entries of the same event, which was going to this conference, which was interesting. And she was invited because she was an insider, and she apparently stood up and told everyone there what was really going on. And then Angla begins to fade into the background when the Unitarians decided they were going to take on this issue. She worked all the time. She wasn't in the cities. She had no status. If they invited superintendents of hospitals to a meeting, they couldn't have Angla, the lowest of the low. A hero in so many ways. But at that meeting, she made contact with another woman whose name is Genevieve Stiefel, who was a member of the church and in that meeting. And Genevieve was selected to be, what, in 1946? The secretary of this new mental health committee that the church was going to set up. And their goal was to spend a year studying the issue so they would really understand it. And when I, read some of the materials and began to look into this Genevieve Stiefel's life, she was a prominent community activist. She was from Boston. She attended Radcliffe College, the most elite women's institution associated with Harvard in the country. She had married well. Her husband was a professor at the university in the history department. I assumed from reading that, and I got a certain amount of information from the Radcliffe alumni, which is online. People write what they're doing, and you go back to 1930 or 1935, and there were entries from Genevieve about her life. Angla would have called her one of the grand ladies of St. Paul, which is a term she used. And it was all, the entries in the alumni were all quite posh, sabbaticals in Europe and raising 2 children and, working in all these public service. I found a granddaughter and a great-grandson. One is a professor at Berkeley, and the granddaughter is in Minneapolis, and she's a social worker, but they knew nothing of their grandmother and had no memory or knowledge of her life. So this is what I thought of her, if I can find it. Here it is. This is what she wrote, Genevieve. I learned the tools of continuing education in new fields of endeavor and standards of workmanship applicable to such jobs as the community asked me to do. Aside from the intellectual disciplines, I was given an ideal to work toward, the mark of an educated woman, to be able to place herself in the other fellow's place with understanding, without regard for his status in life, his race, his creed, or his temporary loss of dignity. And I read that and I thought, noblesse oblige, right? You know, she was a grand lady and she wanted to help others. But I started doing some more research, like what more can I learn about her? And I did this sleuthing, and I found a completely different person. Using Ancestry.com and Google, I learned she was a little Irish girl, Genevieve Fallon, born in a poor Irish family in Boston, Irish Catholic family. Her father was a laborer, her mother was a shirt maker. She, worked in a factory. Her father died of tuberculosis when she and her sister were quite young. I found her in a census, living with a grandmother and uncles, all laborers. The mother disappeared. This doesn't sound like a Radcliffe girl. This doesn't sound like someone who could go to this elite, expensive institution. So I wrote to Radcliffe College to see if they'd send me any information about Genevieve Stiefel, class of 1928 or earlier. How in the world? I had to cajole them, tell them that I was writing because she was such a, good, incredible person. And they sent me the files, the kind that disappear after 2 weeks, a week or something. And there was a whole different person. Her principal in a suburb I'd never seen associated with her called her very, very choice and brilliant. But on the application where it said father, deceased, mother was this name, which turns out to be a social worker, not her mother. And there was a place for her mother's address that was listed, and I'll tell you the miracles of the internet. I discovered that in the time of this, in this period, it was a Catholic home for destitute women. And then I found her mother in Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts. So Genevieve was brilliant, noticed by a principal, had a social worker. I guess maybe she had been removed for some terrible reason from her grandmother in a foster home. And the contact was a social worker for the college. And Genevieve reinvented herself. This poor little Irish girl reinvented herself at Radcliffe, and she got good grades because I saw all her grades. She had a C or 2, but otherwise they were good grades. The former professor wanted to make sure and check that. Think of how difficult that would be emotionally, to be in a school of elite, wealthy, prominent, children of prominent people, and there she was. But she dated this Harvard graduate student, Lawrence Stiefel, and followed him to Minnesota when he came to be a professor at the university, assistant professor. Then I found her that she and the Professor Stiefel joined the Unitarian Church, this Unity Church in St. Paul. And my guess is, what church would marry a Catholic and Lawrence Stiefel, who was Jewish? In the 1920s, do you think you could have walked into a church in this town and said, we want to get married? No. So that's how she got there. She became a wife, a mother, a community activist, prominent in the church. She overcame her tragic past, but she what I interpret from this is she carried forever, deep in her heart, a knowledge. When she talked about the less fortunate, that was her. That was her. She was less fortunate, less from a sense of noblesse oblige, as she wrote it, but from an intimate knowledge of true misfortune. And she was smart. So her motivation now becomes clear, that she, threw herself into this issue, into this effort as well. And then I had this moment of incredible excitement. Now my kids think I'm crazy when I say how excited I was. I was in the Minnesota Historical Society, and there were papers of Genevieve's in the Historical Society because her husband was a historian. And so, things she worked on like fair housing, and she worked with Hubert Humphrey when he was the mayor of Minneapolis, and all of those things are, in her papers. And so I was reading through stuff, and I found some handwritten letters, and I started reading them, and I turned the page over. They were written to Mrs. Stiefel, and they were from Angla. That was their connection. And Angla wrote letters because she was so worried that these Unitarians would get snookered by the powers that be and wouldn't know what was really going on. And so she was giving advice to Mrs. Stiefel from Angla, so that class difference that arose from their very different histories was present, but it was full of insider information. So while Angla had no status and had to work long hours, she saw something in Genevieve Stiefel, made that connection, and really helped the strategy as this group began to understand what was going on through the institutions, and then began to develop an understanding of what it would take to change them. So those are these two women who shared a tragic past, and they appear nowhere. I find a few times Genevieve mentioned in these, the notes of meetings that they took, because she took all the notes. But as it unfolded, Genevieve played this critical role because she made all, like some of you probably experienced, she made the trains run on time. She handed the facts and figures to Reverend Foote, who was the public face, as it turned out, of this effort. But Genevieve, behind the scenes, was making it all happen. She's not in the history books, but she's a powerful figure. And the third one, of the women, different roles. Angla gave me all her information, 3 generations later. Genevieve covered it up, but not good enough for me, as I found out. And the third one is a woman named Jerry Hoffner, because, and here's her role. A year later, after the Unitarians had studied the problem, they were ready to go public. And Arthur Foote wanted to get good press, because the press was, unresponsive and was, basically covering things up. No problems in Minnesota. And he went to a young reporter at the Minneapolis Tribune. She's fresh out of the university, a bright young woman. Oh, you know what? There's Genevieve. Isn't she just what you might have expected? And don't you think formidable is the right word for Genevieve? There's Arthur. He's not on. There's the young reporter. At the time, she was the young reporter. And here she is now. She's now 100 years old. And she's in a nursing home in St. Paul. And that was taken when I gave a talk at the nursing home, and she came to the talk, and she, articulate and gracious and a terrific woman, terrific woman. So she was this young reporter, and she remembered everything. So that was the first and probably the only person who had direct memory. But I taught her something she didn't know as we went through her story. She was a very young and green reporter at the Minneapolis Tribune. And when Arthur asked her if she would write some exposés in the paper, which would require her to go to these institutions and learn, her editor agreed, but he told her that she had to meet with the governor. That was the courtesy at the time, because it was a state institution. And here is a story of her meeting with the governor. Young woman, 22, 23. And this is to make it alive. You can say she met with the governor, but here's how it gives you a context and draws you in. On a balmy October day, and you can check what the weather is on a particular day in history, and it was balmy that day. Her dark eyes shining with excitement, Hoffner dressed in shirtwaist cotton dress and a light sweater, took the streetcar from the offices of the Tribune to the imposing Capitol building in St. Paul. She had butterflies. This was a tough assignment, but it was also a big opportunity for the young reporter. She had a good impression of the governor and admired his accomplishments. She waited in the elaborate anteroom with its rich-grained wood panels walls, enormous oil paintings and gilded frames, and ornate light fixtures. I went. I saw. Describe. A secretary ushered her into the governor's office. This young woman, bright and eager, found herself standing before the governor of the state of Minnesota. She made her pitch for a Tribune series on the institutions. She and a photographer proposed to spend several days in each of the 7 mental hospitals over the course of the winter. They would write the story in the spring. Images of Faribault and St. Peter swirled in Youngdahl's mind. The face of the tall, outgoing, affable governor went from quizzical to skeptical to downright angry. He rose to his feet from behind the desk, dwarfing the petite reporter. "If you try to do this," he bellowed, "I will have your job." He didn't want that story. He didn't want it to come out. And I said to her, "Why do you think he was mad at you? He ended up being the hero. What was going on?" She said, "I don't know." Well, when I meticulously went through all of the records, from the time he was elected until this time when they had this encounter, he was aware that these institutions were terrible. There had been scandal after scandal that had come to him, not necessarily about the people, but about how they were run, which is his responsibility. And he was afraid that he would be blamed if the scandal came out. And so I said, "Well, but you wrote the articles. What happened?" What happened was, right after this, encounter, Jerry Joseph, her editor said, "We're going to write the story anyway, and Youngdahl can look at it." He was scared. But a few days later, Arthur Foote, who had given a talk about the problem, the first sort of public statement of how bad it was, he got a call from Youngdahl saying, come in, mad as anything. What are you people up to, you firebrands? And Arthur said to him, after the governor explained how terrible it would be if this came out, and he said, "It's only a problem in hands other than your own. This is a minister who had no political experience, but that clicked with Youngdahl. If he got ahead of the story, if it was his story, his expose, his goal to clean it up, then it wouldn't be an attack on him, it would be an issue that he could carry to victory. So the articles came out, incredible. They were all in one of the scrapbooks that fell on my head. Incredible articles, huge, full page, 8, 9, times, a whole sequence going through all the issues, one after another. Food, restraints, the whole bit, financing. And that's how it got started. And Jerry Joseph didn't know that one little fact of how Hoffner was her name then, Joseph is her name now, how that something made Youngdahl change. And it was understanding the political consequences or the political opportunity. It was not a consequence, it was an opportunity. And so the rest of the book helps understand how that reform effort succeeded and how they managed it and how they built the coalitions and how they converted the shame to getting people to be advocates for change as opposed to sit in their houses afraid that someone might know that their grandmother or their aunt or their brother was in these institutions. And that's the story. But the 3 women I talked to tonight, you will never find in any of the history books, but they were really Angela the catalyst, Genevieve the competent, and this 23-year-old kid who went and lived in those institutions and wrote the stories and has never forgotten it. Now she's 100 years old. So the last is just to say, here is Luther Youngdahl, who was a great man and very committed. Here he is, signing the legislation in 1949 that started the reform, and below is burning the straitjackets at Anoka 3-4 months after the passage to send a signal to everyone in Minnesota that reform had begun. I think it's a wonderful Minnesota story. Shows you just incredible character and strength, and I think it's an inspiration, even though the reforms, which were magnificent, this is way before the closing of the hospitals, this is 20-25 years before that episode. It really shows you what people can do, And Angela shows us you have a mind, heart, and soul within you, and they did. It's a story worth knowing about, and in my opinion, worth reading. So I think we have a little time. We can have questions or comments or...
Have you ever thought about what you might have done and you never found that bag of papers?
Well, I'm not a superstitious person, but I read that stuff and I knew I couldn't do anything with it. I left it in the bedroom in a bag for about 4 months, knowing there was something there, but not knowing exactly how I could manage to do anything about it. But if I hadn't, there wouldn't be this story.
Our book was read your book, and I'm grateful that you found those papers as well.
Yeah, it was 4 or 5 years, I'll tell you, those were the most intense and exciting and joyous process for me. And I'm glad I found them too. I'm glad my son didn't toss them in the trash.
So these people that worked in the institutions, they didn't really get paid. They got their meals and housing.
They got small amount, yeah.
They did get a small amount.
Yeah. But it was, it's interesting,
There was no incentive to even work in those places.
no,
actually.
except it was a job. Yeah, it was a job. It was worse with the men, because there was this whole class of men who, they called them bug house drifters, that would go from hospital to hospital. They were tough, they were mean, and they would get hired, for these jobs. But, most people didn't want those jobs. And so, and they were so understaffed. In the book, there's lots of comments from Angela about it wasn't our fault. We didn't talk to anybody. We were putting them in there, dressing them, and she'd use the comparison of cattle, and she said, we were only given a certain amount of time. We were only allowed a certain amount of time to get everybody dressed, so we couldn't interact except in these rough ways,
So they didn't really, the patients really didn't get any help.
No, there was, no.
They were
Later
just-
on,
It was just a place to put.
it was custodial, yeah, pretty much custodial. And once you were in, it was hard to get out. But one of the things I found, and there's some of it in the book, in Luther Youngdahl's governor files are hundreds of letters from people about the conditions that their family members were in. And so, and often telling the story of why, the daughter who was a middle-aged single woman, her mother, was senile. She couldn't manage her. She couldn't care for her. And then her mother ends up in Rochester, I think it was, and, dies about 3 months later because she couldn't adjust, and it was horrible. I had people come up to me in giving these talks that gave me letters of, their father and mother, their father after the war, and he'd lost a leg, and he was depressed, and he ended up in Fergus Falls, and then, he was, nobody paid any attention to him, and, the wife would send things, and he never got them, that kind of thing. It was really bad. But there's a lot of material, in unlikely places, like the governor keeping all these letters. That kind of thing. Yeah. But it's amazing how many families were affected. Yeah.
Were there children involved? I know there was a time when Down syndrome children were put in institutions.
Yes.
They were in the same place with the adults?
No, there was one for the feeble-minded and
Okay.
imbeciles.
Yeah.
And many ended up in Cambridge. Epileptics also, that kind of thing. And those exposés are hideous. But in 1951 and 53, Youngdahl made a big, big pitch for the children. And when you read his speeches, they were heartbreaking and heartfelt. And the legislature really dissed him on that. Didn't want to spend the money and that kind of thing. But he really had a big heart for this and really believed in it. So I can tell you the women had this, influence that wasn't known, but without a politician
Yeah.
with the incentive to do it, once he saw that it would be politically possible and positive, not just an attack on him, he really was into it. I really grew to admire him a lot.
When were these institutions closed?
Well, the reform effort, which is worth reading, because I think their reform plans were really good if we had had them and they stayed, because they were based on fundamental human guarantees. That was the word they used, fundamental human guarantees, which they listed as essential for everyone. But then in the 60s, there was a revulsion of the situation. By the 60s, they were just drugging everybody. There were a lot of, I talked at Mayo, and there were a lot of nurses who went through these hospitals in their training, and they said everybody was like semi-comatose. But there became a movement, first of all, for long-term care that was not, if you're senile, it doesn't mean you're crazy, and some federal money for long-term care kinds of approaches, and communities wanting people to stay in their community and not be sent somewhere. That movement that began to, in the 60s, closing the institutions was kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that the institutions were horrible. The problem was, and I just was in California for a few weeks, and everybody was just let out in the 60s. But the plan for community structures, which is what this reform effort in Minnesota was focused on, never materialized. So there weren't places for people to go. And the institutions were very expensive for states, so they were happy to be rid of it, but there was not adequate alternatives that made it work. So, we've made a lot of progress, but most of the mental health advocates say it's not enough, it's not always appropriate for the particular situation, and you got to support it, and you got to know what works for people. And the advocates know what we need to have in many cases, but they can't seem to get the attention given many other issues as well. We need Engla back.
So what prompted the deinstitutionalization of so many of the Minnesota facilities that created the ability to bring folks back to the communities and group homes?
I think that was in the early 60s. But I went up to Fergus Falls, and a friend of mine who lives there gathered together a small group, mostly men, who were working in Fergus Falls when that deinstitutionalization process unfolded. And they cried talking about it, because they knew that these people were going to into situations which were worse than what they were experiencing in the hospitals. And they were very suspicious of me because they didn't want, yet another do-gooder writer, to tell them what animals they were, because they weren't. And they actually built over time relationships with people. They weren't the bad guys. They were the good guys in the sense that they were working because they wanted to help people. And these hospitals in the towns they were in were, boon for employment, and people who worked there a long time. And so you kind of forget that there were a lot of decent people who didn't want bad things to happen, and letting people out and putting them in places that were cheaper but were not better was not an answer, and we're paying the price for that today. Yeah.
I just was going to follow up on a comment about compensation and employment. My grandmother had ultimately moved with my grandparents to St. Peter in 46, and she was a country school teacher, and then in 51 actually got a job at the state hospital and chased that down because that was a much, much better paying position than working at country school, teaching country school. And in fact, when we look at old tax records from my grandparents, she made more than my grandfather, who was a custodian at the state hospital.
And in 51, in 49 and 51, that's when the pay raises went in.
Okay.
And Engla bought a typewriter And so her journals after 1949 were typed, and it was a lot easier to read. But that was part of the reform, that these people are of value, and they need to be paid, and they need to be trained.
And there was the whole civil service test thing and so
Mhm.
forth, so it was.
Yeah, yeah.
You took the test and then, I don't know, 6 or 9 months later,
Yeah.
they got a call or a letter that
Right.
said,
And-
okay, you
yeah.
come up.
And Angela actually got a pension, which was not offered in those first years that she was working. So there was, Youngdahl's efforts were, it's a very detailed and comprehensive kind of approach. You know, one was to get the medical schools involved, you know, because the medical schools said, we don't want anything to do with this. But get the medical school, you know, involved in training on mental health. The VA was light years ahead. It was, you know, it was more than just one aspect. It was, what do we need to do to really help these people and make life decent for them? And it touched a lot of different political efforts in Minnesota, nursing homes, that kind of thing. It was, yeah. Well, we've
Thank you so much.
done our hour.
Susan.
This is great.
Give her a round of applause.